The fluorescent lights of the Detroit diner buzzed overhead like angry wasps as Nyla Cole wiped down table after greasy table, her third job of the day finally coming to an end at 2 in the morning. Her feet screamed inside worn sneakers that had seen better days 3 years ago, but she couldn't afford new ones when every dollar went toward the mountain of debt that threatened to bury her family alive. At 20 years old, she should have been in college like her friends, maybe studying business or psychology, but instead she moved through her days like a ghost haunting 3 different minimum wage jobs just to keep the lights on. The walk home through Detroit's abandoned streets felt longer tonight, shadows seeming to reach for her with grasping fingers while distant sirens wailed their urban lullaby. She wondered if anyone watching from their own struggles could imagine how desperately a young woman might fight to save the people she loved, no matter what country they lived in or what impossible choices lay ahead. The key turned reluctantly in the lock of their crumbling apartment, where paint peeled like dying skin and the heat had been shut off 2 weeks ago. Her parents sat at the kitchen table in the dark, their faces illuminated only by the sickly glow of a single candle that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Her father Marcus held papers in his shaking hands while her mother Diana wept silently into her palms, the kind of hopeless tears that came from souls pushed beyond their breaking point. The sight made Nyla's stomach clench with familiar dread because she had seen this scene before, but tonight something felt different, more final. Marcus looked up when she entered, his eyes hollow with the weight of decisions that no parent should ever have to make. "We need to talk, baby girl," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The envelope on the table bore the letterhead of men who collected debts with interest rates that compounded like cancer, growing larger and more malignant with each passing day. Diana finally raised her head to reveal a face swollen from crying. Mascara streaked down her cheeks like black tears for a funeral that hadn't happened yet. The debt collectors had given them a final option, Marcus explained with the mechanical precision of a man who had rehearsed this speech in his head 1,000 times. There was a man in Seoul, a businessman with connections who needed a wife, someone young and beautiful who could represent his interests in social settings. The arrangement would clear their debts completely and provide Nyla with a life of luxury beyond anything their family could ever offer her in Detroit's dying neighborhoods. Nyla felt the world tilt sideways as the meaning of his words penetrated her exhausted brain. They were selling her, packaging her up like merchandise to be shipped across an ocean to a stranger who had money where they had only desperation. Her mother sobbed harder when she saw understanding dawn in her daughter's eyes. The realization that love sometimes meant making choices that destroyed your soul to save someone else's life. Marcus pulled out a plane ticket dated for tomorrow evening, the boarding pass already printed with her name in stark black letters that looked like a death sentence. The man's name was Kong Jiang, and he ran import businesses throughout Asia, successful enough to pay their crushing debts without blinking an eye. In return, Nyla would become his wife in a ceremony planned for the following week, a transaction dressed up in white silk and flowers to mask its true nature. The hours that followed blurred together in a nightmare of packing and preparation, her parents moving around her like mourners preparing a body for burial. They had already signed the papers, already accepted the money that would save their house and her mother's medical treatments, already committed their daughter to a fate she had no voice in choosing. Diana helped her pack the few nice clothes she owned while whispering apologies that meant nothing against the magnitude of what they were doing. The flight to Seoul stretched endlessly across time zones and oceans, giving Nyla too many hours to contemplate the life she was leaving behind and the unknown future rushing toward her at 30,000 feet. Other passengers slept or watched movies while she stared out the window at clouds that looked like cotton shrouds, wondering if the man waiting for her would be kind or cruel, gentle or demanding, human or monster. Seoul's airport overwhelmed her senses with its gleaming surfaces and rushing crowds speaking a language that sounded like music she couldn't understand. A driver held a sign with her name written in careful English letters, his face professionally blank as he led her to a black sedan that cost more than her family's annual income. The city beyond the windows rose in towers of glass and steel that scraped the sky, beautiful and alien and completely unlike anything in her previous world. The penthouse elevator climbed so high that her ears popped, rising toward clouds that seemed close enough to touch through floor-to-ceiling windows. When the doors opened, she stepped into a space that redefined her understanding of wealth and power, where every surface gleamed with polished perfection and art that belonged in museums hung casually on walls. The view stretched across Seoul like a kingdom laid out for its ruler's inspection. Kong Jang stood with his back to her, silhouetted against the city lights like a figure from a dream or nightmare. When he turned, Nyla saw a face that could have been carved from marble, beautiful in the way that dangerous things often were, with eyes that seemed to catalog everything about her in a single glance. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30, with the kind of controlled power that came from never having to raise his voice to be obeyed. "Welcome to your new home," he said in accented but perfect English, his tone as neutral as if he were discussing the weather rather than greeting the woman his money had purchased. "This is where you will live now, where you will learn to be the wife that my position requires, where you will forget about Detroit and the life that no longer exists for you." The penthouse felt like a beautiful cage, luxurious beyond imagination, but still a prison where golden bars were no less restrictive than iron ones. The morning sun painted Seoul in shades of gold and amber, streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that turned Kong Jang's penthouse into a cathedral of light and shadow. Nyla woke disoriented in silk sheets that whispered against her skin like expensive secrets, momentarily forgetting where she was until the reality crashed over her like ice water. She was no longer Nyla Cole from Detroit, working 3 jobs to survive. She was now Mrs. Kong in name only, a stranger in a stranger's home, purchased like artwork to fill a space in someone else's carefully constructed life. The bedroom door opened without a knock, and a small Korean woman entered carrying a silver tray laden with delicate porcelain dishes that probably cost more than Nyla's monthly rent back home. The woman spoke in rapid Korean, gesturing toward the clothes laid out on the chair, beautiful garments that looked like they belonged in magazine spreads rather than real closets. When Nyla tried to respond in English, the woman simply smiled politely and continued her routine as if language barriers were just another piece of furniture to navigate around. "Mrs. Park," Kong Jang said from the doorway, his voice carrying the quiet authority that made people move without question. "She will help you dress and prepare for breakfast. We have much to discuss about your new responsibilities." His English was precise and unaccented, suggesting education in expensive schools where perfection was the minimum acceptable standard. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, tailored to emphasize the lean strength that came from disciplined living rather than gymnasium vanity. The clothes Mrs. Park had selected fit perfectly despite no one taking measurements, suggesting that Kong Jang's organization was thorough in ways that made Nyla's skin crawl. The dress was beautiful, a soft blue that complemented her complexion, but wearing it felt like putting on a costume for a play she didn't understand. Mrs. Park's gentle hands guided her through morning rituals that felt foreign and elaborate, each step designed to transform her into something refined and decorative. Breakfast was served in a dining room that overlooked the city like a throne room surveying its kingdom. Kong Jang sat across from her at a table large enough for 12 people, reading documents that bore official seals and signatures while sipping coffee from cups so delicate they seemed ready to shatter at a harsh word. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, broken only by the soft clink of silverware against porcelain and the distant hum of Seoul awakening far below. "You will learn Korean," he said without looking up from his papers. "Mrs. Park will arrange tutors. You will also study Korean customs and business etiquette. There will be social functions where you must represent our family appropriately." His tone suggested he was discussing quarterly reports rather than reorganizing someone's entire existence, clinical and detached, as if emotions were inefficient business practices to be eliminated. Nyla tried to cut her food with hands that trembled slightly, whether from hunger, fear, or exhaustion, she couldn't tell. The knife slipped and clattered against the plate with a sound that seemed to echo through the vast room like a gunshot. Kong Jang's eyes lifted from his documents for the first time that morning, studying her with the intensity of someone cataloging interesting specimens. She ducked her head and reached for the fallen utensil, desperate to avoid his penetrating gaze. The sleeve of her dress rode up as she leaned forward, exposing the mottled purple and yellow bruises that decorated her wrist like grotesque jewelry. The marks were gifts from her father's final conversation, when love had worn the mask of violence and desperation had spoken through gripping fingers that left their signature on her skin. She tugged the sleeve down quickly, but Kong Jiang had already seen what she tried to hide. His newspaper folded with the crisp precision of origami, and suddenly the vast dining room felt smaller, more intimate and dangerous. Kong Jiang rose from his chair with the fluid grace of a predator, moving around the table until he stood beside her with the quiet intensity that made the air itself seem to hold its breath. His presence radiated controlled power, the kind that came from never needing to prove itself because everyone already understood the consequences of challenging it. "Show me your arm," he said, his voice softer than she had heard it before, but carrying an undertone that suggested refusal was not truly an option. Nyla's heart hammered against her ribs as she slowly pushed back the sleeve, revealing the constellation of bruises that mapped her father's desperate goodbye. Kong Jiang studied the marks with the clinical attention of a doctor examining evidence, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "Who hurt you?" he asked, and the question hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications that Nyla couldn't begin to understand. His voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow it carried more weight than if he had shouted. The concern in his tone was so unexpected that it made her eyes burn with tears she had thought were exhausted from the previous night's crying. "My father," she whispered, the words scraping her throat like broken glass. "He was trying to make me understand that I had to come here, that I had to do this for the family. He wasn't trying to hurt me, just make me see that there wasn't any other choice." The explanation sounded hollow even to her own ears, justifications that crumbled under the weight of purple evidence painted across her skin. Kong Jiang's fingers moved toward her wrist with surprising gentleness, stopping just short of touching the damaged skin. His hands were scarred in places, old marks that spoke of violence in his past, but they remained steady as surgical instruments as they hovered over her bruises. "There is always another choice," he said, his voice carrying a conviction that seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. "Not for people like us," Nyla replied, meeting his eyes for the first time since arriving in Seoul. "We don't get choices, just consequences for other people's decisions." The bitterness in her voice was sharp enough to cut, years of powerlessness condensed into a handful of words that laid her soul bare before this stranger who owned her future. Something shifted in Kong Jiang's expression, a crack appearing in the marble perfection of his controlled facade. For a moment, she glimpsed the man beneath the carefully constructed exterior, someone who understood powerlessness in ways that money and authority couldn't completely erase. His hand finally settled on her wrist, warm fingers encircling the bruised skin with the careful pressure of someone who knew exactly how much force could break things. "Your father will never touch you again," he said with the quiet finality of someone making a promise to the universe rather than just to her. "No one will hurt you while you are under my protection." The words should have sounded possessive or threatening, but instead they carried a weight of commitment that made something tight in Nyla's chest begin to loosen for the first time since leaving Detroit. "Why?" she asked, studying his face for signs of deception or hidden motives. "Why would you care what happens to me? You bought me like furniture. I'm just another acquisition for your collection." The challenge in her voice surprised them both, a spark of the defiance that 3 minimum wage jobs and crushing family debt hadn't quite managed to extinguish. Kong Jiang was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing the edge of a particularly dark bruise with the reverence usually reserved for precious artifacts. "Because no one deserves to wear their family's desperation on their skin," he said finally. "Because you are here now, which makes you my responsibility, and I do not allow my possessions to be damaged by anyone except myself." The honesty in his words was more terrifying than any threat because it acknowledged the reality of her situation while simultaneously offering something that might have been protection or might have been a more sophisticated form of control. Nyla found herself studying his face, searching for clues to the man behind the criminal empire, wondering if kindness could exist in someone who trafficked in human lives, or if this was simply a more elaborate form of psychological manipulation. Mrs. Park appeared in the doorway as if summoned by invisible signals, carrying a small medical kit that suggested this wasn't the first time she had been called upon to tend to injuries in this household. Kong Jiang stepped back to give her room to work, but his eyes never left Nyla's face as the older woman gently cleaned and bandaged the worst of the bruises with the practiced efficiency of someone who had seen violence before and learned to heal its aftermath. 3 days passed in the strange rhythm of Kong Jiang's controlled world, where every meal appeared at precisely scheduled times, and every interaction followed patterns that felt rehearsed rather than natural. Nyla moved through the penthouse like a ghost learning to haunt a palace, exploring rooms that felt more like museum exhibits than places where people actually lived. Kong Jiang disappeared each morning in his tailored suits, returning in the evenings with the weight of unspoken business hanging around him like expensive cologne that couldn't quite mask something darker underneath. The Korean lessons with Mrs. Park filled the long afternoons with stumbling pronunciation and cultural rules that seemed designed to keep women small and decorative. Nyla learned to bow at precisely the right angle and speak in the soft tones that Korean society expected from wives, even as rebellion burned in her chest like swallowed fire. She was becoming fluent in submission, mastering the art of disappearing while remaining visible, a skill that felt like dying by degrees. On the 4th morning, Kong Jiang forgot to lock his study before leaving for what Mrs. Park indicated through gestures and broken English was an important business meeting. The oversight seemed uncharacteristic for someone who controlled every detail of his environment with military precision, but Nyla discovered that even criminals could be distracted when dealing with matters that truly mattered to them. The door stood slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of mahogany and leather that suggested serious business conducted in serious rooms. Curiosity proved stronger than caution as Nyla pushed the door open and stepped into Kong Jiang's private sanctuary. The study was lined with books in multiple languages, legal texts mixed with philosophy and literature that suggested intellectual depths beneath his criminal exterior. But it was the wall of photographs that made her breath catch in her throat. Dozens of images showing young women who looked like her, faces marked by the same desperation and fear that she recognized from her own reflection. The photographs were organized with disturbing precision, connected by red string like a detective's murder board that mapped relationships and patterns across continents. Names were written in careful handwriting beneath each image, along with dates and locations that traced a network spanning from Detroit to Seoul to cities she had never heard of. These were the other women, the ones who had been sold like merchandise to fill spaces in other men's carefully constructed lives. A manila folder labeled with her own name sat open on the massive oak desk, containing documents that made her hands shake as she read them. Her father's debt history stretched back years, a carefully cultivated crisis that had been managed and manipulated by people who understood exactly how to create the desperation that made families sell their daughters. The paperwork revealed Marcus Cole's gambling addiction had been fed by loan sharks who worked for the very organization that ultimately purchased his daughter. Bank statements showed payments made to her father over months, small amounts that escalated his gambling while deepening his debt, creating the perfect storm of financial ruin that would force him into the unthinkable decision to trade his daughter's freedom for his family's survival. Someone had been watching the Cole family for over a year, studying their vulnerabilities and crafting the trap that would deliver Nyla directly into Kong Jiang's hands. But the most shocking discovery was a thick file marked with FBI logos and official seals that suggested Kong Jiang was not simply a criminal, but something far more complex and dangerous. Surveillance reports detailed trafficking operations across 3 continents, with Kong Jiang's name appearing not as a target, but as a confidential informant working to dismantle the very network that had brought Nyla to Seoul. The documents revealed a man walking a razor's edge between 2 worlds, maintaining his criminal facade while secretly gathering evidence that could destroy everything he appeared to represent. The study door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like a judge's gavel in the silence. Kong Jiang stood in the doorway with his suit jacket draped over one arm and his tie loosened around his neck, looking like a man who had rushed home to discover his carefully guarded secrets scattered across his desk for inspection. His face revealed nothing as he took in the scene, the open files and Nyla's obvious shock at what she had discovered about her own situation. "You were not supposed to see this," he said quietly, moving into the room with the controlled grace of someone who had learned to manage crisis through absolute composure rather than panic. His voice carried no anger, only a resignation that suggested this moment had always been inevitable despite his attempts to control the timing and circumstances of her discovery. Nyla held up the folder with her name written across it in handwriting she now recognized as his own careful script. "You've been planning this for months," she said, her voice shaking with emotions she couldn't quite identify. "My father didn't just get desperate enough to sell me. You made him desperate. You created the situation that brought me here." The accusation hung between them like a blade, sharp with betrayal and the terrible understanding that nothing about her situation had been accidental. Kong Jiang moved to the window and stared out at Seoul's sprawling landscape, as if the city might offer answers to questions he had been avoiding for years. "My uncle built this organization on the suffering of women like you," he said without turning around. "When he died and left me his empire, I discovered that everything I inherited was built on foundations of human misery. I could have simply destroyed it all, but that would have freed the other criminals while doing nothing to save their victims. So instead you decided to become one of them," Nyla said, gesturing toward the photographs of desperate women whose faces would haunt her dreams. "You became everything you claimed to despise, buying and selling human beings while telling yourself it was for some greater purpose." The bitterness in her voice could have stripped paint from the walls. Years of powerlessness crystallized into accusations that cut through his careful justifications like acid through silk. "I became what I needed to become to gather evidence that will destroy them all," Kong Jiang replied, finally turning to face her with eyes that burned with conviction and something that might have been guilt. "Every transaction I make, every woman who passes through this organization, becomes part of a case that will eventually free hundreds of others and put the real monsters in prison forever. Your situation is temporary. Their suffering ends permanently." The logic was seductive in its moral complexity, but Nyla could feel the trap hidden beneath his noble intentions. "And what happens to me when your investigation is complete?" she asked, moving closer to the desk where her file lay open like an autopsy report. "Do I get returned to my family like damaged merchandise? Or do I become collateral damage in your war against trafficking?" Her voice had grown steady as anger replaced shock. The same fury that had sustained her through 3 minimum-wage jobs now focused on the man who had orchestrated her captivity. Kong Jiang was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with the intensity of someone reading a book that might contain either salvation or damnation. "That depends entirely on you," he said finally. "You can disappear tomorrow with enough money to start a new life anywhere in the world, completely free from both your family's debts and my organization's reach. Or you can help me finish what I started, knowing that your cooperation might save dozens of other women from the fate you've experienced." The choice should have been simple, but Nyla found herself studying the photographs on his wall, faces that looked like her own sister might look in a few years if their family's desperation continued to compound like interest on an unpayable debt. She thought about the other girls who were even now being groomed by loan sharks and traffickers, families being systematically destroyed to create the perfect conditions for selling daughters into slavery disguised as marriage. "What would you need me to do?" she asked, hating herself for the question but unable to ignore the possibility that her suffering might prevent others from experiencing the same nightmare. Kong Jiang smiled for the first time since she had met him, an expression that transformed his face from marble perfection into something recognizably human. "Help me understand how they recruit families," he said, moving to sit on the edge of his desk so they were eye level with each other. "Your perspective as someone who lived through their manipulation could help identify other families being targeted. Your intelligence and outsider status make you invisible to them while being invaluable to me. Together we could save lives while building something that neither of us could accomplish alone." The transformation began with a single word whispered into a device no larger than a button, hidden beneath the elegant pearl earrings that Kong Jiang had presented to her as if they were simply beautiful jewelry rather than sophisticated recording equipment. Nyla practiced speaking naturally while the tiny microphones captured every nuance of conversation, learning to become a weapon disguised as a decoration, deadly precisely because she appeared so harmless and ornamental. Kong Jiang spent hours teaching her the subtle art of intelligence gathering, showing her how to ask questions that seemed like innocent curiosity while actually probing for information that could destroy lives and topple empires. She learned to read the micro-expressions that revealed when someone was lying, to recognize the tells that indicated nervousness or guilt, to position herself in rooms so that recording devices could capture conversations between men who believed women were too stupid or insignificant to understand their business. The first criminal meeting she attended as his wife took place in a restaurant that served food as beautiful as art, while hosting conversations about human trafficking that made her stomach turn with revulsion. She sat beside Kong Jiang wearing a silk dress that cost more than her family's monthly income, smiling politely, while men discussed shipping routes and delivery schedules for cargo that turned out to be terrified women sold by desperate families just like hers. Kim Tae-sung ran the sole operations with the efficiency of a legitimate businessman, complete with spreadsheets and quarterly reports that tracked profits from human misery with the same attention to detail that other companies apply to selling electronics or automobiles. He spoke about the women as inventory to be managed, discussing their ages and appearances like specifications for manufactured goods, completely divorced from the reality that each number represented someone's daughter or sister or mother. The American market is expanding rapidly. Kim explained to the table of well-dressed criminals who nodded along as if he were discussing weather patterns rather than human trafficking. We have identified 17 new families in Detroit alone who are approaching the critical debt threshold that makes them vulnerable to our recruitment strategies. The precision with which he described their methods made Nyla's blood run cold, understanding that her family had been targeted with scientific ruthlessness. Nyla kept her expression pleasant and empty while the recording device captured every word, playing the role of the dutiful wife who was too concerned with her appearance to pay attention to her husband's business discussions. She had become invisible through perfecting the art of being exactly what these men expected women to be, decorative and silent and intellectually irrelevant to their important masculine concerns about profit margins and distribution networks. But as weeks passed and she attended more meetings, Nyla began to see patterns that even Kong Jiang had missed from his position inside the organization. She noticed how the traffickers identified vulnerable families, the specific combination of financial pressure and emotional manipulation they used to create the perfect storm of desperation that made parents willing to sell their children. Her perspective as someone who had lived through their tactics revealed weaknesses in their system that could be exploited. The breakthrough came during a meeting with Chun Wei, who controlled trafficking operations throughout Southeast Asia and spoke with casual brutality about the merchandise that passed through his networks. He mentioned a shipment of 15 girls arriving from Myanmar, all between 14 and 18 years old, destined for clients in Los Angeles who had specific preferences for young Asian women who spoke no English and had no connections to trace. Nyla felt rage building in her chest like molten metal as Chun described the girls as if they were luxury cars being delivered to discerning customers, complete with detailed specifications about their physical attributes and previous experiences. The recording device captured every disgusting detail while she forced herself to remain motionless and expressionless, becoming a perfect witness to evil that would eventually ensure these monsters faced justice for their crimes. After the meeting, Kong Jiang found her in the penthouse bathroom, silently vomiting from the stress of maintaining her facade while listening to men discuss the systematic destruction of innocent lives. He held her hair back from her face while she purged the poison of what she had heard, his hands gentle on her shoulders as she trembled with fury and revulsion that threatened to consume her from the inside. "You did perfectly," he said softly, offering her a warm cloth to clean her face while his eyes burned with admiration for her strength and determination. "The information you gathered tonight will save those 15 girls and probably dozens more. You are becoming exactly what we need to destroy them completely." His praise should have felt patronizing, but instead it filled her with a sense of purpose that made the nausea recede into determination. But their success was drawing attention from people who had survived in the criminal underworld by being suspicious of anything that threatened their profitable operations. Park Jun-ho, Kim's lieutenant, had begun asking pointed questions about Kong Jiang's new wife, and her surprising interest in attending business meetings that most criminal spouses avoided like plague. His eyes followed Nyla with the calculating attention of a predator who sensed something was not quite right about the prey. During a particularly tense dinner meeting, Park commented on how quickly Nyla had adapted to Korean business customs, suggesting that most American women found such gatherings boring and preferred shopping to serious discussions about import and export operations. His smile was sharp as a blade as he studied her reaction, clearly fishing for responses that might confirm his growing suspicions about her true role in Kong Jang's organization. "My wife is unusually intelligent for an American woman," Kong Jang replied smoothly, his hand settling possessively on Nyla's thigh in a gesture that looked like affection but felt like protection. "She understands that a successful marriage requires interest in all aspects of her husband's life, including his business relationships and professional obligations." The warning in his voice was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who understood the language of criminal hierarchies. But Park was not easily deterred, and over the following weeks his questions became more direct and his surveillance more obvious. Nyla noticed the same faces appearing in different locations when she went out with Mrs. Park for language lessons or shopping trips. Men who tried to blend into crowds while clearly reporting her movements to someone who had become suspicious of the American wife, who asked too many questions and remembered too many details. The crisis came during what should have been a routine dinner with potential business partners from Thailand, men who specialized in recruiting girls from rural villages by promising factory jobs in Bangkok before selling them to international trafficking networks. Nyla was recording their conversation about expansion into American markets when she noticed Park watching her with the intensity of someone who had finally solved a puzzle that had been bothering him for weeks. She felt his eyes tracking her movements as she reached for her wine glass, noting how she positioned herself to capture optimal sound quality from the recording equipment hidden in her jewelry. When she excused herself to use the ladies' room, Park followed at a discreet distance that confirmed her worst fears about how much he had discovered about her true purpose in attending these meetings. Kong Jang intercepted Park before he could corner Nyla in the bathroom, creating a distraction by loudly discussing a shipping problem that required immediate attention from everyone at the table. But the damage was done, and they both understood that their operation had been compromised by someone who was too smart and too suspicious to ignore the evidence that had been accumulating around them like storm clouds gathering on a previously clear horizon. That night, Kong Jang held her against his chest while Seoul glittered beyond the penthouse windows like a constellation of possibilities and threats. "I will not let them hurt you," he whispered against her hair, his arms tightening around her with possessive protectiveness that had evolved from duty into something deeper and more dangerous than either of them had intended to feel. "We are too close to finishing this to stop now, but your safety matters more than the mission." Nyla pressed her face against his shoulder and breathed in the scent of his expensive cologne mixed with something uniquely him, realizing that somewhere in the process of becoming his weapon against trafficking, she had also become something precious to him in ways that transcended their original arrangement. They were no longer captor and victim, no longer even just partners in a dangerous game, but two people who had found something worth protecting in each other despite the circumstances that had brought them together. The raid began at dawn with the precision of a military operation, black vehicles converging on locations across Seoul, while international law enforcement agencies coordinated simultaneously in 15 cities spanning 4 continents. Nyla watched from the safety of a secure FBI facility as months of carefully gathered evidence finally unleashed justice like a tsunami across the criminal networks that had destroyed countless lives in pursuit of profit. Kong Jang had turned himself involuntarily the night before, walking into FBI headquarters with boxes of additional evidence that would ensure no one in his uncle's organization could escape prosecution. His surrender had been negotiated as part of the plea agreement that would see him testify against every criminal he had worked with during his years of undercover investigation, trading his freedom for the dismantling of trafficking networks that spanned the globe. The evidence they had gathered together painted a horrifying picture of systematic exploitation that reduced human beings to commodities traded like any other business investment. Bank records showed millions of dollars flowing through legitimate businesses that served as fronts for trafficking operations, while recorded conversations revealed the cold calculation with which criminals identified and groomed vulnerable families for exploitation. Nyla's recordings had captured Kim Tae-sung discussing the psychological profiles they used to target desperate parents, explaining how debt collectors and loan sharks worked together to create the perfect storm of financial ruin that made families willing to sell their children. His voice on the recordings was clinical and detached, as he described human suffering as simply another business expense to be managed efficiently. Park Joon-ho's arrest came as he tried to flee Seoul with suitcases full of cash and hard drives containing client databases that law enforcement had been seeking for years. His capture prevented the destruction of evidence that would prove crucial in prosecuting customers who had purchased trafficking victims, closing the loop on both supply and demand sides of the criminal enterprise. The International Tribunal convened in The Hague to hear testimony about crimes that transcended national boundaries, requiring cooperation between governments that rarely agreed on anything but could unite in pursuit of justice for trafficking victims. Nyla sat in the witness box wearing a simple black dress, facing a panel of judges while cameras broadcast her words to audiences around the world who needed to understand the reality of modern slavery. "My name is Nyla Cole," she began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. "6 months ago, I was sold by my desperate parents to pay debts that had been systematically created by the very organization I am here to expose." What followed was not a marriage, but a carefully orchestrated form of slavery disguised as legitimate business arrangements. She described the recruitment process with painful precision, explaining how her father's gambling addiction had been fed by loan sharks who worked for trafficking organizations, creating the desperation that would ultimately force him to trade his daughter's freedom for his family's survival. The judges listened with expressions of controlled outrage as she detailed the psychological manipulation that made victims complicit in their own exploitation. The courtroom fell silent as Nyla explained how families were targeted not randomly, but through careful analysis of financial vulnerabilities and emotional pressure points that made them susceptible to offers that appeared to be rescue, but were actually traps. Her testimony revealed the sophisticated nature of operations that most people dismissed as crude criminal enterprises, exposing the business intelligence and psychological expertise that made trafficking so devastatingly effective. When Kong Jiang took the stand, his testimony carried the weight of someone who had lived inside the criminal empire while working to destroy it from within. He described the organizational structure with the precision of a former insider, naming names and revealing bank accounts and operational methods that had been hidden from law enforcement for decades. "I inherited my uncle's empire believing I could reform it," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years spent walking the razor edge between justice and criminality. "What I discovered was that you cannot reform evil, only expose it to the light where it cannot survive. Every day I spent in that organization was another day that innocent people suffered from my hesitation to act decisively." His confession detailed years of gathering evidence while maintaining his cover as a legitimate trafficker, describing the psychological toll of attending meetings where human suffering was discussed like quarterly profit reports. The prosecution used his testimony to connect criminal networks across continents, revealing how trafficking operations coordinated internationally to maximize profits while minimizing law enforcement interference. The evidence Nyla and Kong Jiang had gathered together proved devastating to the defense strategies of criminals who had believed themselves untouchable due to their wealth and political connections. Recorded conversations revealed bribes paid to officials, threats made against investigators, and the systematic corruption that had allowed trafficking networks to operate with virtual impunity for years. Chun Wei's arrest in Bangkok came as he attempted to destroy servers containing customer databases and financial records that would implicate trafficking clients across Southeast Asia. The evidence seized from his operations led to raids in 12 countries and the rescue of over 200 victims who had been held in conditions that constituted slavery regardless of legal technicalities about consent. As testimony continued, the true scope of the trafficking network emerged like a malignant tumor being surgically exposed. Operations spanned from recruitment villages in Myanmar and Cambodia to delivery points in Los Angeles, London, and Dubai, with sophisticated logistics networks that rivaled legitimate multinational corporations in their efficiency and global reach. Nyla watched from the gallery as traffickers who had seemed untouchably powerful were led away in handcuffs, their empires crumbling under the weight of evidence that she had helped gather through months of dangerous undercover work. Each arrest represented dozens of potential victims who would never experience the nightmare she had survived. Families who would never face the impossible choice between watching their children starve or selling them to monsters. The Myanmar girls Chun had mentioned in that recorded conversation were found in a shipping container bound for Los Angeles, rescued hours before they would have disappeared forever into trafficking networks that treated them as disposable commodities. Their rescue was directly attributed to intelligence Nyla had gathered while pretending to be a decorative wife interested only in shopping and social functions. Kong Jiang's sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following month, with prosecutors recommending a reduced sentence in recognition of his cooperation and the years he had spent gathering evidence at considerable personal risk. His testimony had been crucial in securing convictions against over 50 traffickers and would likely result in additional prosecutions as investigations continued across multiple jurisdictions. But victory came with a price that made Nyla's chest tight with emotions she struggled to define. Kong Jiang would spend the next 5 years in federal prison, paying for his crimes even as his cooperation saved countless lives and dismantled criminal empires that had operated with impunity for decades. Their partnership, forged in the crucible of shared danger and mutual purpose, would be severed by the justice they had fought together to achieve. On his last night of freedom, Kong Jiang held her in the penthouse that had been both prison and sanctuary, watching Seoul's lights twinkle beyond windows that had witnessed their transformation from captor and victim into something far more complex and precious. "Tomorrow you become free in every sense that matters," he said against her hair, his arms tightening around her, as if he could somehow hold back the dawn that would separate them. Nyla pressed her face against his shoulder, breathing in his scent and memorizing the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, knowing that she was losing the person who had seen her strength when everyone else saw only her vulnerability. Freedom felt hollow when it meant losing the man who had helped her discover her own power, but she understood that justice required sacrifices from both victims and perpetrators in the pursuit of something larger than individual happiness. 5 years passed like seasons changing, each one marking another milestone in the reconstruction of lives that had been shattered by trafficking networks and rebuilt through determination that refused to accept defeat. Nyla stood in the conference room of the Survivor Advocacy Foundation, addressing an audience of former trafficking victims who had become advocates themselves, their faces reflecting the same transformation from victim to victor that she had experienced in Kong Jiang's penthouse years earlier. The foundation had grown from a single office in Detroit to an international organization with locations in 15 countries, funded by the assets seized from convicted traffickers and supported by governments that finally understood the true scope of modern slavery. Nyla's testimony had become the template for training law enforcement agencies worldwide, teaching investigators how to recognize recruitment patterns and identify families being targeted by trafficking organizations. Maya Chin sat in the front row, a young woman who had been rescued from the Myanmar shipping container that Nyla's intelligence had helped locate. She now ran the foundation's Southeast Asian operations, using her own experience to help other survivors rebuild their lives, while working to prevent new victims from falling into the same traps that had nearly destroyed her future. 342 families have been identified as being targeted by recruitment operations this quarter, Maya reported during their monthly coordination meeting, her voice steady with the confidence that came from transforming trauma into purpose. "Our early intervention programs have successfully prevented 87 trafficking cases by providing financial assistance and counseling before families reach the crisis point that makes them vulnerable to traffickers." The prevention programs represented everything Nyla had learned about how trafficking organizations operated, using that knowledge to identify and protect families before they could be exploited. Financial counseling helped parents recognize and avoid predatory loan practices, while education campaigns taught communities to recognize the warning signs of trafficking recruitment disguised as legitimate business opportunities. Dr. Sarah Williams, the foundation's chief psychologist, presented research showing how survivors who became advocates experienced better long-term mental health outcomes than those who remained focused solely on their own recovery. The transformation from victim to protector seems to provide a sense of agency and purpose that traditional therapy alone cannot achieve, she explained to the assembled advocates who nodded in recognition of their own experiences. Nyla's own healing had come not from forgetting what had happened to her, but from ensuring it could not happen to others, channeling rage and trauma into systematic change that made the world safer for vulnerable families. Her parents had eventually moved to Detroit, their relationship rebuilt through years of therapy that helped them understand how their desperation had been manipulated by criminals who specialized in exploiting parental love. The Foundation's Witness Protection Program had relocated over 100 families whose testimony against trafficking organizations had put them at risk of retaliation. Former victims like Nyla understood the unique challenges of rebuilding identity after trafficking, creating support networks that helped survivors navigate everything from legal name changes to job training programs that taught marketable skills. Kong Zhang's release from federal prison came on a Tuesday morning in spring, 5 years of incarceration having transformed him into someone harder and more focused than the man who had entered those walls. Prison had not broken him, but refined him like metal in a forge, burning away everything unnecessary to reveal the essential core of someone committed to redemption through action rather than words. Nyla waited for him outside the prison gates, wearing a simple blue dress that reminded them both of their first breakfast together in his penthouse, when she had been a terrified girl and he had been a criminal pretending to be her husband. The years had changed them both in ways that made their original relationship seem like a story about different people entirely. "You came," he said, as if her presence was unexpected despite the letters they had exchanged throughout his incarceration, correspondence that had evolved from duty into something deeper as they shared their separate journeys toward redemption and purpose. "I promised I would," Nyla replied, studying his face for signs of the man she had known beneath the harder edges that prison had carved into his features. 5 years is a long time to wait, but some promises are worth keeping regardless of how difficult the circumstances become. Kong Zhang had spent his prison years working with federal investigators, providing intelligence that led to additional prosecutions and helping to train agents who worked trafficking cases around the world. His insights from inside criminal organizations had proved invaluable in developing strategies to disrupt recruitment operations before they could target vulnerable families. The Foundation offered Kong Zhang a position as Director of Intelligence Operations, a role that would allow him to continue his work against trafficking networks while building something constructive from the ruins of his criminal past. His acceptance came with the understanding that redemption was not a destination but a daily choice to use his knowledge and experience in service of justice rather than profit. Their first collaborative project involved establishing training programs for former criminals who wanted to work against their previous associates, creating pathways for redemption that benefited both individual transformation and broader law enforcement efforts. Kong Zhang understood better than anyone how difficult it was to leave criminal life behind, and his programs addressed the practical and psychological challenges that made recidivism so common. The Foundation's annual conference brought together survivors, advocates, law enforcement officials, and policymakers from around the world to share strategies and coordinate efforts against trafficking networks that constantly evolved to avoid detection. Nyla's keynote speech drew standing ovations from audiences who understood that her transformation from victim to leader represented hope for everyone who had experienced trafficking. As she spoke about the importance of survivor voices in shaping anti-trafficking policies, Nyla caught Kong Zhang's eye in the audience and saw the pride and admiration that had never dimmed despite years of separation and the complexity of their shared history. Their relationship had evolved beyond the dramatic circumstances that brought them together, becoming something built on mutual respect and shared commitment to protecting others. The evening gala celebrating the Foundation's 5th anniversary was held in a ballroom that rivaled Kong Zhang's old penthouse in elegance, but the money that paid for it came from legitimate sources and supported legitimate purposes that helped rather than harmed vulnerable people. Survivors who had become successful advocates mingled with supporters who provided funding and political backing for anti-trafficking initiatives. Maya Chun announced that the foundation had successfully prevented over 2,000 trafficking cases and helped prosecute 830 traffickers worldwide. Statistics that represented individual lives saved and families kept together through intervention and support. The numbers were impressive, but Nyla knew each one represented someone's daughter or sister or mother who would never experience the nightmare she had survived. Kong Jiang approached her during the reception, offering champagne in crystal glasses that sparkled under ballroom lighting that made everything seem possible and golden. To second chances, he said, raising his glass in a toast that encompassed everything they had built together from the ashes of trafficking networks and criminal empires. To new foundations, Nyla replied, clinking her glass against his while understanding that their toast celebrated not just their work but their relationship, rebuilt on equality and shared purpose rather than the power dynamics that had originally brought them together. They had become partners in every sense that mattered, bound together by something stronger than circumstance or obligation. For those who have found strength through connecting with stories of survival and transformation, what moments in your own life have taught you that redemption and new beginnings are always possible, no matter how dark the circumstances may seem?